Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone.
Welcome back to Hope Blooms. I am Maria Servold, EPLA's president.
And I'm Emily Carrington, the executive director of EPLA. And today we are going to talk about caring for your marriage following miscarriage. And I think this is a good dovetail from our last episode where we sort of wrapped up talking to Pastor Hennis about husbands shepherding their wives. But I think there's a whole lot we can say on this topic. I think the reason, or at least more we can say on the reason we need to talk about this.
Right.
And I think we've alluded to this before, right? Where a trauma like miscarriage, both individuals in the couple grieve differently. And that can put a strain on the relationship.
Right. In sort of any grief situation, I think that's true.
Right.
But particularly in a miscarriage, because it's this thing, it was just between the two of you, right?
Yeah, and I think we have seen that throughout many of our episodes. It either has been talked about directly, or we sort of see that as people tell their story. It's just so much a part of the story of how one person is processing and the other person is processing differently. So I think that there's a lot to unpack there. I'm not sure we're here to tell you exactly. Neither one of us are relationship counselors, but we both have our own experiences and we've walked through this a lot with friends. And I think it's something worth at least talking about and starting the conversation on, because I think it's important after experiencing a trauma that you take care of each other.
Yeah. And yes, and sort of don't let the relationship suffer, don't neglect that core relationship, even if things are difficult, which is hard, but
it is hard. And I think sometimes you sort of start, I don't know that this is encouraging, helpful information, but sometimes you do have to sort of walk through and endure for better or worse in sickness and health. And sometimes you have to let things be sad for a minute. I've experienced that where we're always trying to care for each other, but that doesn't mean it is always romantic or happy, or that sometimes there's a distance in that sadness, but also there's seasons.
Well, and I think similarly to when we've talked about how as like a friend or family member, you can support someone who's had a miscarriage, just asking your spouse, or you asking your spouse the question, what do you need? Right? Like, how can I help you right now? Without assuming what you think they might need, because it could be very opposite of what you think they need.
And I think that can be healing for both of you to hear what the other one needs, to hear how the other one is grieving. The experience, one thing I think we hear and I saw the experience is so different for each person, where the wife is going through this physical experience on top of the grief, and she's going through this hormonal experience, and depending on when the miscarriage occurred, she had a different connection with that baby, and regardless of her knowledge of that connection, the baby was inside of her. So for me, I was sick. I felt my body change. I was very aware. I wasn't very aware of the baby yet, but I was very aware, not in the way that I was with later full-term pregnancies, but I was very aware there was a baby. Everything I did was like the first pregnancy.
With that in mind.
The first pregnancy, I kind of this wasn't necessarily healthy, but I got really obsessed with making sure everything I ate and drank was healthy for the baby. And so everything I did, from how I slept to how I walked and worked out and worked and ate, everything was all of a sudden for the baby.
Right. And like intentional.
Right. So yeah, it's a very different experience.
Whereas your husband in those early stages, I mean, not only does he not have anything happening in his body, but many men say they don't really feel like a father until the baby's born and they hold it, right? So they are sort of particularly separated or, not yet connected in that physical way, right?
Right.
And so they're, that whole massive part of the loss then is only really being felt by the woman.
Right. And I think that's different we've talked about this before. There's these general gendered reactions, but then we've had stories where it is different for different people and different men connect. And there's different situations that make miscarriage grief. Are we excited about this baby in the first place? Was this planned? Is this a good situation? There's all these different things that make the grief challenging and difficult, right? So you have the death of the child, and then you have the context,
right?
The context in which the death happened,
right?
So we're not here to sort of tease out that grief, but I think that setting that up, it gets really messy then working through this with your partner.
Yeah,
I think you're right. Starting with what do you need, and you may not know,
right? Yes, I feel like I just felt like this soggy mess. And the best that my husband could do, which was great, was like just sit with me, and sort of comfort me and that kind of thing. And then, with the physical needs afterward, like once you're home, they can help with that, which is great. And then not really weirdly, but like later, I'd have sort of these like sudden recurrences of, grief. And so then I think he was sort of like, what? That you're having another breakdown about this?
You're sad again?
Yeah. What? I wasn't ready for this. And he was great at comforting me and like helping me feel better and all this. But I think he just was sort of surprised by it, that it could sort of recur later in such a strong way.
Well, I think that's important too. Men and women are different in this way too, though. I found like mine were not unrelated to then my hormonal cycles.
Yes, right.
Re-kicking in.
Right.
Or other cycles that my body was just more in tune to. So my first cycle after the loss was, of course, that's already a hormonal, emotional time. Now it's like pile on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Same for me. I think I felt like it was happening again. Like I remember having this fear that I'm losing another baby, and Ryan was like, "No, this is just your regular cycle. It's okay." It's like I couldn't understand in my head that my body could be back to like the quote normal way of operating, but because of like the physical aspects of that,
right? And it shouldn't get back to normal, right?
Right. And it's like it triggered me into this episode of fear. And I remember I was at work. He came to my office and like sat with me and made me feel better. Because I was just like losing my mind, and he came and talked me down. So.
Right. And I think what we're saying is that we talk about this too, leaving space for each other to grieve. So after you say, what do you need? The answer might be hard, but you've got to be able to sort of just walk into this darkness together. Sometimes I have likened marriage to less of, we talk about, I don't know, we have all these happy ideas of how you choose a partner and all these ways of who, how are you going to have a successful, happy marriage? And I think that's all good and right. But sometimes marriage feels more like, who are you driving the tank with? And if you have a good co-pilot, you're going to be okay. But that means you're going to drive through a lot of suffering, a lot of war zones. But that also means you need to have space for that suffering and not be afraid of that suffering, and to be able to face it head on together and to face each other's suffering. Right. Because avoiding it is just going to worsen everything. Right. Like if you can't even talk to the one person who you should most be able to talk to, or, comfort that person, then it's going to be harder for everyone. So yeah, it's like, which is scary, right? To be like, we're going into this, like you said, this darkness together. But if you stick together, it'll be better. Yeah. And I think it's okay too to ask for help and to ask for help together. Yep. and to, there's these circles of support and sort of the whole, it's like a target, right? Like it's all holding each other up.
Right.
So it's okay to look to those rings outside of you.
Yes.
And to help each other get help.
Right.
If you need help.
Right.
And to talk to others and to encourage that, to make space for that. Maybe if you have other children, it's saying, you know what, I think if you want to go to that support group, we're going to make that work in the evenings, or we're going to look for pastoral counseling together. Or if one or both of you need therapy, which it's totally appropriate to need therapy after a miscarriage. I think that is getting more normalized. But when we started this, it really wasn't.
Right.
It is a traumatic event, and it might be a traumatic event for both of you. Thinking about the physical experience and what my husband had to see.
Yes. Oh, right. I mean, imagine watching the person you love the most suffer physically and emotionally in this terrible way. Of course, that's going to be affecting to them and difficult.
And me experiencing my own trauma and then him watching it. That is a major undertaking. So it's okay to both admit you need help.
We had sort of the weird circumstances. When I had my loss, my father-in-law happened to be in town helping work on our house. And he arrived like between when the loss started and then, I thought it was taken care of. And then like 10 days later, I had to have a D&C. So he arrived in that gap. So it was already sort of awkward that like this thing had happened and then he came to stay. And then I had to go back to the ER and all this. And he was actually really great. It's like he did things that he knew would be helpful, but without, I don't know, like he just kept making dinner, right? Like I remember he made dinner several nights, which normally I was doing for him and Ryan when he was there. But he was like, I'll just take care of it. And I just thought, well, that's just about the most wonderful thing you could do. Like, I don't really want to sit and talk to you about it necessarily, but if you make dinner for all of us, that's great. Plus he was, doing all this work on our house. But it took a situation that I thought was going to be awkward and weird, that he was there in this hard time. And it turned out great. So
well, and I think to allow for that vulnerability in family relationships. And I think we're so disconnected from life and death and vulnerability and blood.
Yes.
It's so sanitized, but the familial relationship, right? Like, let's talk about those circles that support you. My mother-in-law had come to stay with us, and praise the Lord, she was a nurse. So she wasn't any more scandalized or traumatized, but, bless her. She cleaned our bathroom after our loss, which was not
not a job you would go ask someone to do normally.
And she just did, and she was just there and she was just present. And it's really vulnerable. It's really vulnerable, but the family relationship is there. I mean, you think about how we've existed for all of humanity, right? Like
the in-laws would have always been around, right?
Right. And so I think that's important. And I think relying on that family support, if you have it, and the friend support to help, it requires being vulnerable.
Right. And even to be vulnerable about, like, if it's been hard with your spouse, it's okay to, like, if like a bullseye, that's a great way to think about it. Like, there's the core relationship, but then there's one around it that can like surround it and help it, outward, and to go to those people, throughout.
Because it might be really hard to understand each other.
Yes. I will never forget this thing we heard in our marriage prep, which it is sort of like a, reduced, simplified explanation, but I find it helpful. They said that men often mainly deal in facts and women often deal in feelings. Again, we're reducing here, like it's just a generalization. But then they said, but for women, sometimes feelings are facts. And so like for the men to be able to recognize, because if you say, I feel this way, and they're like, well, don't feel that way. It's like, I can't not feel this way. And so it's helpful for a husband to be able to recognize, she's feeling this way and it can't change. Like she's in it. It can't change. I can't necessarily fix it by doing or saying something. Right.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think it's important to sometimes feelings, we were just talking about sort of the cyclical nature. I'm all full of analogies today.
Yeah.
I don't know why. But I was just talking with my daughter the other day about feelings being like waves and trusting that the wave will end. We've got tanks and targets. Don't hold up my, like, none of these need to hold into one analogy.
Just lots of examples.
Just lots of examples. But the wave will end.
Yeah.
And sometimes you've just got to surf the wave, and sometimes you've got to hold on tight. But knowing that it's going to come in waves and that they're facts, that doesn't delegitimize the feeling.
Right.
But the intensity of the feeling will pass. The intensity of this moment will pass. And if it's digging up other communication issues, if it's digging up other, then, you know, ride the wave. Like I said, neither one of us are marriage counselors. I don't want to get too deep into how to fix something.
Right.
But I do think it's appropriate to tend to and care.
And to not be afraid if the marriage feels hard, particularly hard after this kind of, you know, there's nothing, you know, you don't need to feel like, oh no, now we don't work anymore because this thing happened and we can't talk to each other. Like it's understandable to be, that it's hard to talk to each other and you can work through it together. Yeah.
One thing I think, looking at my experience after my first loss, we were really able to, and I know this was a luxury, we were in a weird time in life. So there was a lot that wasn't luxurious. Like we were getting ready to move. It was just, but in all of that, it gave us a lot of space. I took a few days off of work, not enough, but a few days off of work waiting for my DNC. And my husband was in this transition period where he was getting ready to graduate with his PhD and change jobs. So we had all this space. And we sort of allowed ourselves to grieve together separately. So like one day we lived in Waco and we went to Cameron Park, which is this beautiful walking trail by the Brazos River. And it's got a lot of like offshoots and harder trails. And we just walked the easy trail and found a spot by the river. And we both took what we needed to grieve. So I think I took my Bible and some poetry. And he took, I don't know, some theology books and some, I don't know. He's an intellectual. He took things that were a lot like, again, like we grieved together separately. And again, that's admitting like reading was helpful for both of us. And we just sort of sat by the river. And I think we were actually like, you know, maybe 10, 15 feet apart. Like we were not sitting next to each other snuggling. We were both in our spot, reflecting, meditating, and taking time. That's a moment I have in my head together. It was really sort of a beautiful moment and a beautiful space. And so to do things together, and we really, this is what I guess I was starting on saying, we really walked through the grief together, arm in arm, in our tank. And in some ways, like I look back at other suffering and challenges we've had to go through, and miscarriage, we also, you know, we had a sick kid, she's all better. Those things that we could do arm in arm strengthen the marriage. We've unfortunately had, you know, some later sufferings where he was sick. And that was really challenging because we were walking through such a different experience. And so I look back at how this was also sort of, we're talking about how it's uniquely different for a husband and wife, but it also is sort of can be uniquely joining. And I really think that was our experience. And as I compare it to other suffering we've walked through, it was something that we could cling to each other.
Yes.
It did happen to both of us. And he very much respected that I was the one with the physical experience. I was the one who, and he even said, like, he felt a little bit like he didn't know how to grieve and he needed to put his grieving off. And that was a challenge But I do think ultimately it was something I viewed as something that happened to both of us and that we were really in this together.
Yes. Well, and the fact that the child was a part of both of you, right? I mean, I think about when, 6 years after our loss, that my father-in-law who made us dinner, died of a heart attack the day after Christmas. And so then I had to be supporting Ryan, at first just sort of like, I don't know what to do and to say,
Right.
Because of course I was grieving as well, but it wasn't my own father who I'd known my whole life,
Right.
I mean, at that point I'd known him a handful of years. And so, yeah, it like you're saying, sort of interesting then on the flip side, how to handle it and how to help. And it was different because, he had this lifelong relationship with his father,
Right. Right. And with our miscarriage, both of our lives changed.
Right.
And our plan and the way our home would be. And so
right. I keep thinking about when we interviewed the Waleses, Catherine and Jordan, and how the way he dealt with it was to write that beautiful prayer, remember? Right. And I don't remember when he said like how soon afterward he did that, but like that was what helped him to grieve and to heal was to do this specific thing.
Right. And I highly recommend going back and listening to those back to back. And I think they're just such a beautiful example. I keep remembering, taking care of the wardrobe, right? You wanted to oil the wardrobe.
Yeah,
and these different things you tend to and do or get in your head and need to do, and giving yourself space to work through that. I think so we've talked sort of philosophically and emotionally and relationally. I do think there are some things, and maybe these are just generic like marriage advice, but I think it's okay too to take time to tend to the marriage as you would in any other situation. Like go to the movies. One thing I wish I would have done that I would do more in trauma is laugh and laugh together. I've heard of other couples, watching comedies every night during cancer treatment because you've got to laugh.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important. I think we underestimate laughing together.
Yeah.
And I wish I did that more in trauma. And I don't think I've been intentional to do that. And I think you have to take trauma seriously.
Yeah.
I don't think you can laugh at the trauma. But I think when there is a time and place where everyone is safe again,
Yep.
but still sad, that it's okay to watch a funny movie.
It's not like we do, and we shouldn't, I don't think. I'm glad we've moved away from the X number of weeks of like grieving and you're not allowed to X, Y, Z,
Yeah.
I mean, like, because if you together are feeling like, okay, we're walking through this. Yes, we're still sad. We'll never be like over it. Right. But it would help us both to do this thing that's enjoyable. That's okay. Like there's no rule against that. And it's good to be to be able to talk to each other enough to understand that might be helpful.
And to know it might be different, that it might not be a perfect like romantic dinner and date. It's going to hang over. It's going to hang over so much. It's going to hang over. We're talking about the relational, but like it's going to hang over your intimacy. It's so connected to that intimacy. And I think it's important to be in touch with how you're handling that. So it's not going to be the same sort of romantic date and sweep you off your feet. And that's okay. But it's also okay to go out to dinner, to go to a movie, to do something together, something you like together. I think is an important and good, and something I wish I would have done more in traumatic experiences, and especially laugh together,
right?
Get that emotion out and bond.
Yeah, it's so interesting. All these very distinct memories.
Yeah,
but after my loss, I remember sort of distracting myself for several things. One, I read this huge, like 900-page book, History of the New York Times, and it was fascinating. But like I just sat there for days and read this book. It's in like a memoir style. It's very good. But then we also watched or like rewatched that sitcom from, I guess, the 90s. Was it called Coach? About the football coach? Yeah.
I don't remember.
Okay.
This sounds right.
Like in Minnesota or whatever, just a sort of silly sitcom, but we watched that every day, like every night. So then we were able to laugh at that together. It also was like nostalgic because I remembered it from my childhood, but like that's my memory. It's like my father-in-law working on the house, reading the New York Times book and watching the coach show. And, but that we bonded over that, right? We enjoyed it together. It was something that would sort of give us a little levity,
Right. And those easy sitcoms. It does not need to be like smart comedy or angry stand-up or whatever it is that just makes you giggle.
Yeah.
I think is important for a relationship.
Yeah.
I think to laugh together. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we've been helpful to everyone.
Some great metaphors.
Lots of metaphors.
But just to encourage you to not ignore the marriage, that core relationship after a loss.
And to not despair. And it's hard. Marriage advice is hard. I want to be the last to give perfect marriage advice. I knew more. It's like raising kids, right? Mm-hmm. Like when you're like, I knew more before I had any.
Yeah. I knew exactly what kind of parent I would be before I was a parent.
Right. But I do think sort of the urge to tend to and care for and not neglect and enjoy the moments you can. Mm-hmm. And to realize that suffering together can strengthen your relationship and your trust and your vulnerability together.
Yeah.
And it's really important that I look back over the last 14 years and that those are the moments that really can build trust. I think that's maybe some last advice is to try to trust each other and try not to compare grief.
Yeah.
It's never healthy.
Mm-hmm. Or to blame each other.
Or to blame yourself. Mm-hmm. It's okay to walk through that together and sad. So I think if anyone else, we'd love to hear from people. It could even be we could even put a blog post together or some other information. If there's anything just any stories of hope or thoughts or ideas, I think this is one where I think everyone is different. Every relationship is different. Every need is different. Mm-hmm. If anyone has found some great resources, I think this is definitely something.
Be good to share.
We would love to hear. So email us at miscarriagecare@gmail.com. And we would absolutely love to hear from you. Mm-hmm. So thank you for joining us today. This has been another episode of Hope Blooms. Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.